Senator, you have 15 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chairman, and thanks, Mr. Browne, for coming in. Can I talk first about your time with the Irish Times? What did you write about? What were the themes and areas that you wrote about while you were there?
How much time do we have? I covered an awful lot of areas in the Irish Times. I was an editor in the education section for a large section of my time there. I worked in the newsroom as doing general reporting for a time as well. I did a lot of feature writing, a lot of arts coverage, reviewed film and theatre, books. I had a column for many years about radio. I was the radio critic for the Irish Times, and I edited also a media studies page aimed at secondary school students in the paper.
Did you ever experience editorial interference?
Oh, of course. I mean, that's that is part of the structure of any news organization, or of any organization. When you say editorial interference, that means, did anybody in a position of power in the organization ever suggest that I should or shouldn't do something in a certain way? Yes, of course. I mean,
apart from guidance and mentoring, as I'm sure any boss would provide, yeah, was there ever a line you were taking that you were advised to adjust for any reasons that were unusual?
Well, an interesting example, perhaps, because it touches a little bit on the ownership question in a slightly askew way. We've already said that the Irish Times is owned by a trust, but the major rival to the Irish Times owned by a large organization. On the media studies page that I mentioned that I was editing, we did a full page sort of exploration for, as I said, for young people, of the issue of media ownership, with a very large photograph of the proprietor of the organization in question, the rival organization to the Irish Times. I'm being very careful here. One of the Irish Times editors came down to me the following week after that particular page had come under some attack in the rival publication for some of its statements, and said, maybe it's a good idea not to pick a fight with that particular organization and to do it in that particular way. Let's, when you're doing, carry on, but let's just not go there in terms of like raising questions about the ownership of a rival organization.
Okay. So specifically, did you ever have any experience of what we might call corporate interference, where a particular line was I suppose, adverse to advertisers? Was there any kind of interference like that where an editor said, look, could you be more commercially sensitive, or, that?
No, I can't say that I did. I was editor of a supplement called Education and Living, and there was, the purpose of that supplement was to cover the education sector. There was a long-term hope within the paper that it would attract advertising, that it would, particularly recruitment advertising for the education sector. And there were occasionally discussions about, can we find ways to do stories that are going to make the supplement more of a fit for the needs of these people, so that they will understand that it's all well and good to advertise on a Friday in the business section, but they should also be advertising on a Tuesday in the education section. So certainly the myth of the very firm wall between editorial and advertising, that nobody from one side ever looks into the other side, is just that. It's a myth. Certainly the discussions took place, but I can't say that it ever impinged very directly on my practice, except for the example that I gave.
Yeah. Well, apart from your own personal writings or whatever, yeah, I mean, would you have been aware in your time at the Irish Times, or indeed since in your research, of any situation where there was a threat to withdraw advertising, or indeed that there was a threat carried out in withdrawing advertising because of an editorial line being pursued by?
There was a case, and again, I'm going to be careful in discussing this, but one that I'm very familiar with and that I have reported on in the time since I left the Irish Times, where a senior journalist within a newspaper that no longer exists was relieved of his position after a piece ran under his jurisdiction that was lightly mocking of a prominent property advertiser. That advertiser approached the managing director of this newspaper directly, and the consequence within 24 hours was the termination of the employment of this particular journalist. So it's the examples of this are not copious. I think for the reasons that were discussed in the earlier session, journalists usually understand the lines that they need to be careful about crossing. But certainly that is that's a very good example of someone who crossed a line and paid with his job.
Certainly a very relevant one. We can't mention names or organisations, of course, but can you say, did that happen in the era that we're looking at?
Yes,
in terms of the property boom?
Yes, it did. It happened. It did. It happened late in the era that we're talking about, as there were beginning to be questions raised about the bubble.
Okay, that's very good. Can I ask? No, I won't be allowed to ask that, so I better move off.
Better researcher.
Yeah. The chairman mentioned some of the oversight and of the press council and codes of conduct. I mean, you know, in practice, are they sufficient or insufficient in your view?
I have to say, I have myself been a complainant in relation to using the code of practice, so I feel that my view might be prejudiced in that respect, Senator, and I would prefer not to enter into a direct commentary on that.
Is there, as part of the codes of conduct that exist and between the NUJ and then I think papers such as the Irish Times have their own specific one internally as well, yes. Do they govern things like gifts or junkets, issues like that?
That's a very good question, and at times they have, and at times those sort of guidelines tend to fade. Certainly, for most of the time that I was in the Irish Times, we had a very active ethics committee within the paper, comprising staff from the newspaper, editorial staff, and there was a close eye kept on who was paying for trips and who was paying for lunch, and there was a strong feeling that journalists should pay their own way or they should not take part in certain kinds of activities with potential sources and potential subjects of stories at all. And I know that some newspapers continue to try to hold the line on that sort of activity. To be honest, the overwhelming practice, I think, in the industry is fairly lax in that respect, whether or not there are written codes in place that suggest it. And I must say the code of practice of the Press Council of Ireland does not make specific reference to that sort of provision.
Would you have been aware, again, and we can't mention names or organisations in your own career of you know, the bestowing of a gift or tickets for the Champions League?
Of course, yeah, of course, absolutely, repeatedly. And you know, there were examples from quite early on in my career in relation to property interests specifically that you know, were dealt with within the organisation in question.
Property interests. I mean, giving property, or do you mean?
I would prefer not to even go as specific as that, Senator. Okay. But yes, where there was a gift that raised questions within the organisation, and there were steps taken to address it. So I mean, it certainly wasn't the case that there was a sort of a freewheeling culture of. Yeah,
no, just on that, because I don't want to misunderstand you. I know we can't talk about names, and I won't, Chairman. But are you saying that property was given to somebody?
In effect.
All right, and we're not talking tickets to a match now. We're talking bricks and mortar here, are we?
In effect, yeah.
Okay, and in your experience, was there a direct correlation between that instance and maybe positive writings?
It will be into very
specific. Or not, as the case may be, or not.
You could be talking very adversely there, no, that maybe.
Yeah, no, I would prefer not to make a statement along those lines, Senator. I think that it's fair to say, you know, in general, that while, you know, the vast majority of journalists working in the property area would not be engaged in anything remotely resembling corrupt practices, that the relationship between property developers, estate agents, etc., and the journalists working in those areas are such that conflict doesn't generally arise a great deal between them. There's there's not really any need for gifts or the showering of, you know, that there's a shared interest in property journalism as traditionally understood, and property supplements, a shared interest in the promotion of property sales. I think that property journalism, in some respects, gets a little bit of a hard, gets bashed a little too hard sometimes in these discussions. It is a kind of a genre unto itself. It features some of the most beautiful writing in some ways in journalism, and I think most readers understand what property journalism is and can see it for what it is. My concern really about property supplements is not so much the journalism that was in them, so much, or the relationships that existed between individual journalists and the interests that are represented there, but the insidious effect that their very existence had on larger aspects of newspapers. So for example, it's one thing to have the property supplement saying, you should buy this beautiful home in Ballsbridge. It's another thing to have the business advice column treating houses as just another asset class that people are invited to invest in. I think that in some ways that's more insidious.
Yeah, just again, Chairman, you correct me now if I'm veering off here, but this is my last question. I won't need the additional time. In your experience, is there a demonstrable correlation, and are there instances of this, between positive writings and the bestowing of gifts?
It's a kind of a virtuous circle, I would say, Senator, that in the fields like fashion, like property, certain aspects of business coverage where there's a kind of a routine low-level bestowal of gifts. But I mean, that's a famous quote about journalism that I can never remember precisely, but it's in effect, why would you bother bribing a journalist when you see how easy it is to get them to write exactly what you want for free? And I think that that characterizes the relationship between business interests and journalists much more clearly for me than any notion that there's a kind of a sort of a corruption even at a low level.
But there were instances, you think?
Oh yeah, but as I'm saying, the correlation is a sort of a virtuous circle, that the journalists who are known to write nice things were invited along, and they might be given a sample product, or they might be given a nice lunch, or whatever. That there was you didn't have to be doing the journalism as a direct response to this lovely, dessert that you got and the delicious wine that accompanied it. You did the story but you might have been getting the dessert wine because of the lovely coverage you've been given today.
Just finally, then, in terms of supplements in newspapers, and property, you yourself said you edited an education supplement. Has it become the practice, and is this a new phenomenon, that supplements are about telling the story of the commercial interest relevant to that, or is it a critique? So is it a cut and paste thing from the brochures of the corporates representing those sectors, or is it an investigative critique? Go to college A instead of college B because, buy a house A instead of house B because, as perhaps it should be. Has it become, do you feel or not, a scenario where it's cutting and pasting more from the brochures of the corporate world rather than the kind of professionalism and journalism that you referred to earlier?
It would be, generalizations are always dangerous, but I think, and certainly if you pick up a business supplement of an Irish newspaper, you will find interesting, critical analysis of the activities of business people within a certain critical framework that is what I would describe as a narrow ideological one, in the sense that we were discussing earlier with Dr. Mersil, but that there is real critical journalism in business supplements, in an education supplement. Certainly, we didn't have a client base in the same way.
This will be a final question.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So just to stay with the educational example.
Sure. Yeah.
If College A had a full-page ad and College B had an eighth of a page, would the editorial
I must say that
reflect that these days?
We never had that worry terribly much in our education supplement of
Sure,
colleges
yeah,
taking
but I'm
out
just
full-page
an
ads.
analogy.
But no, I think it would be fair to say that that journalists would be certainly outside of the very explicit supplements like special reports and property, that are actually designed to be ad magnets. And, you know, and sometimes the distinction can be a little unclear. I mean, I picked up the Sunday Business Post the other day. It's a wonderful newspaper, but as you flip through it, there's certain pages that say focus on this or that, and you can see that they've essentially been designed as ad bait. When you see something like that, you say, oh, well, you know, that there is an element of a pretty direct correlation between the advertising and the editorial here. On the other hand, you know, I think that by and large, for instance, in a business supplement, in the Irish Independent or the Irish Times, I don't think that the journalists are looking down to the bottom of the page to see who made the larger ad in order to determine who gets the better coverage.
Okay, thank you. Just for ad bait, is that